By the beginning of 1170, Saladin was in control of as much territory in the south as his leader Nur-al Din up north. He was now ready to flex his political muscle. He went on the offensive against the Franks at Gaza and Aila on the Red Sea. He also established his own military corps, which he called the Salahiyya. Saladin was intent on creating religious unity throughout the kingdom. In September 1171, on the death of the Fatimid caliph of Baghdad, al-Adid, Saladin had the name of the Sunni Abbasid caliph of Baghdad, al-Mustadi, inserted into Friday prayers. After 202 years, the Fatimid caliphate of Cairo was at an end. Saladin had established himself as the unchallenged Sultan of Egypt. Meanwhile, from Damascus, Nur-al Din had become concerned at the growing power of Saladin. He decided that the rising star needed to have a careful watch put on him. Over the next 3 years, Saladin's power was solidified, and by the beginning of 1174, he looked to pose a serious threat to the Syrian ruler. Nur-al Din began making preparations to attack Saladin. However, on May 15, 1174, Nur-al Din died suddenly, under mysterious circumstances. He was just 57 years of age. On hearing the news, Saladin didn't waste any time. He fast-tracked it to Aleppo to claim the top position. But he got there too late. Al-Salah, the 12-year-old son of Nur-al Din, had already been named as Syria's new ruler. The boy was well aware of the threat that Saladin posed. Despite his tender years, he acted decisively, refusing to allow Saladin to enter the city. As a result, Saladin and his army had to camp outside of the gates of Aleppo before returning to Egypt. Towards the end of 1174, the Emir of Damascus requested Saladin's help in fending off a threat from a former captain of Nur-al Din, by the name of Gamustagin, who had kidnapped the young al-Salah and attempted to take control of all his territory. Saladin immediately rode north and set up his base at Damascus. He then set about besieging Gamustagin at Aleppo. The defenders of the city were aided by crusaders under Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, who gathered threateningly for an attack on the invaders. Then, taking no chances, Gamustagin employed the services of a group known as assassins to infiltrate Saladin's camp and kill him. 13 assassins gained entry into the camp. However, they were detected before they could get to their target and killed by Saladin's guards. Saladin now gave up on his siege of Aleppo and turned towards Hama in western Syria, a city he had already conquered. There he prepared to face a crusader army, but that enemy withdrew, allowing Saladin to declare a great victory against the infidels. His next move was against the western Syrian capital of Homs, which he took after overcoming strong resistance. In 1181, al-Salah, now 19 years old, died. Like his father before him, the circumstances were mysterious. This time, Saladin was able to swiftly ride in and take control. With this move, he had unified Egypt and Syria. His massive territories effectively encircled the Crusaders based in Jerusalem, and Saladin threatened to strangle the life out of them. Having fought and bullied the Muslim world into an unlikely coalition, it was now up to Saladin to deliver the knockout blow that would finally restore the Holy Land. To that end, he declared a jihad, or holy war, against Jerusalem. In November 1177, Saladin marched from Cairo with a force of 30,000 men. Baldwin IV, the new ruler of Jerusalem, decided to preempt an attack on his city by taking 375 knights and several thousand infantry to Ascalon on the Mediterranean coast in expectation of a siege. But Saladin refused to be sucked in. He simply bypassed Ascalon, sending a force to surround it, and headed directly for Jerusalem. Baldwin and about 80 of his best Knights Templars and a few thousand infantry bravely broke out through the surrounding forces and rode at full speed to intercept Saladin's advance. The attack from the rear took Saladin by surprise, inflicting a crushing blow on his army. His full bodyguard was destroyed, along with 90% of his army. Saladin himself only escaped because he was escaping on a camel, which was able to outpace his pursuers on horseback. It took Saladin years to rebuild his army. He built it up with internal conquests within his empire, taking Mosul and northern Iraq. He also negotiated a truce with the Crusaders, which gave both sides breathing space. Then, in December 1185, he became seriously ill. For 3 months, he was out of action, but then he recovered to refocus on his political jihad against the Christians. In the summer of 1187, Saladin attacked the Crusader city of Tiberias. This was part of the territory that was under the dominion of Raymond III of Tripoli. When the Muslims struck, Raymond's wife was in the city. She sent a messenger to Jerusalem, beseeching the new king, Guy of Lusignan, to come to the city's aid. A Crusader army was assembled, consisting of 20,000 troops and 1,200 knights. Saladin, with 30,000 men, advanced to meet them. The two armies clashed on July 4, 1187. The Muslim archers sent devastating waves of arrows into the Crusader ranks, causing many casualties. Saladin rode up and down his lines, encouraging his men on to victory. Finally, the Crusader leaders called for a retreat, but the Muslim army had set fire to the surrounding grassland, preventing them from going anywhere. A terrible slaughter ensued, with Saladin's secretary Imad ed-Din al-Isfahani later recalling that the people of the Trinity were eaten up by a worldly fire of 3 kinds, each irresistible and overwhelming the fire of racing flames, the fire of raging thirst, and the fire of whistling arrows. The disaster for the Crusaders has become known as the Horns of Hattin. King Guy and Reynaud of Chatillon were among the few to survive and were taken prisoner by the Muslims. They were escorted to the Sultan's tent, where Saladin offered a drink of ice-cold rosewater to Guy. Guy then handed it across to Reynaud, but Saladin grew angry, proclaiming that he had not given it to his enemy, Reynaud. By the Muslim warrior's code of war, if a prisoner is offered food or drink by his captor, his life had to be spared. Saladin did spare Guy's life, stating that kings do not kill kings, but he killed Reynaud by his own hand. On the following day, Saladin ordered the execution of the surviving warriors among the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. Saladin seated himself on a mounted platform and watched, with his assembled soldiers, as the Christian warriors were put to death agonizingly slowly by his inexperienced holy men and mystics, who had begged for the privilege of carrying out the executions. The stunning victory at Hattin had left Jerusalem virtually defenseless. Within days, Acre was taken without a fight. Within 3 months, the Muslims had taken control of Jaffa, Haifa, and Ascalon. On September 20th, 1187, the siege of Jerusalem began. The city's defense was under the command of Balian of Ibalin, yet he lacked the manpower to mount any sort of a defense of the city walls. The fact that he managed to hold his attackers for 9 days with just a handful of men was an extraordinary achievement. On September 30th, Balian came out of the city to negotiate terms of surrender. Saladin demanded nothing short of unconditional surrender, but Balian refused, telling Saladin that he would order his men to kill their own women and children and then destroy all of their valuables. They would then fight to their deaths on the city walls. The bravery of the Crusader greatly impressed Saladin. He agreed to accept payment for the lives of the inhabitants of the city. Balian was unable to raise enough money to secure the release of all 33,000 inhabitants of the city, and about 18,000 of them were taken into slavery. The other 15,000 were ordered to march out of Jerusalem en route to the coastal city of Tyre. So it was that on October 2nd, 1187, the Holy City was returned to Muslim control. Christian symbols including the cross that had been placed on the dome of the rock, were torn down, and the great Al-Aqsa Mosque was restored to its former glory. The fall of Jerusalem created outrage throughout the Western world. It was claimed that Pope Urban III collapsed and died on hearing the news. His successor, Pope Gregory XIII, called for a third crusade. England's dashing new king, Richard I, known as the Lionheart, was determined to personally lead the charge. Meanwhile, Guy of Lusignan had been released by Saladin. Basing himself at Tyre, he rebuilt his army and then besieged Acre. The siege became bogged down, dragging on for 2 long years. The attacking army was bolstered in June 1191 with the arrival of Richard the Lionheart at the head of a 17,000-man army. By the thousands, the Crusaders were camped on a plain outside the city walls. Still farther back were immense hordes of Muslims under Saladin, watching for an opportunity to come down upon the plain and overwhelm the Christian armies. Down below, the Crusaders were making continued assaults on the city walls in the hopes of breaking through before the enemies on the mountains could attack them. Taking control of the siege, Richard offered his men payment in gold for every stone that they could remove from the base of one of the towers on the outer wall of the city. This incentive proved to be the deciding factor, with the tower soon falling. The Crusaders rushed into the city, quickly overcoming the resistors and taking 3,000 prisoners. Richard attempted a ransom exchange with Saladin, who was holding prisoners of his own from the Battle of Hattin, along with the True Cross, which Richard also demanded. When the Muslims were slow in responding, Richard ordered the execution of all of his prisoners. In reprisal, Saladin had some 2,500 Christian prisoners put to death. King Richard had his sights on liberating Jerusalem. On August 22nd, he left from Acre, marching southwards along the coast towards Jaffa. Saladin's larger army followed behind, harassing them at every turn and trying to draw the Crusaders into battle. However, largely as a result of Richard's tight formations and leadership skills, the Crusaders stayed focused and refused to play the Muslims' game. Finally, on September 7th, the increasing Muslim pressure forced Richard's hand. Immediately south of the forest of Azraf, he halted the march and wheeled his men around to face the enemy. The battle began at 9 a.m. with repeated showers of arrows coming from the Muslim side. For hours on end, the Crusaders sheltered in formation behind their shields. The mounted Hospitallers at the rear of the Crusader formation were the most badly affected, with many of their horses being killed. Finally, the Hospitallers could take it no longer. Against the order of Richard, they charged for the Muslim archers, slashing at them with their swords. They then pushed through to meet the Muslim cavalry. Before Richard knew what was happening, a third of his army had followed the Hospitallers into the fray. He had no choice now but to order a general attack. The Muslims were thrown back by the massed assault. Saladin eventually called for a withdrawal, but not before losing 7,000 men, including 32 of Saladin's best officers. He withdrew into the interior to regroup. Meanwhile, Richard carried on to Jaffa. He prepared to move on to Jerusalem, but soon divisions arose among his senior men. Some wanted to move on to Egypt first, while others were intent on moving directly to the main target. Richard also realized that a march on Jerusalem would take him far away from his supply lines on the coast. He was also well aware that Saladin's army was regrouping and would strike back harder than ever. On top of that, winter was fast approaching, which would put interminable hardship on his men, especially if they were forced into a prolonged siege. As a result of all of this, Richard decided that it made sense to attempt to open peace negotiations with Saladin. The result was the Treaty of Jaffa, which bound both men to a 3-year peace. The Christians would keep Acre, Jaffa, and Ascalon, and the relic of the True Cross would be returned. As a compromise, Christian pilgrims would be allowed to enter Jerusalem to worship at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Richard then returned to Europe, bringing the Third Crusade to an end. Within 6 months of the king's departure, Saladin was dead. The 56-year-old succumbed to yellow fever. He died in Damascus on March 4, 1193. Prior to his death, he had given away nearly all of his possessions. He was buried in a plain wooden box. Following his death, Saladin's great empire became splintered. His 17 sons fought over territory and civil wars broke out all over. Within 60 years, much of the empire had fallen to a people who had once been the slaves of the Syrians, the Mamluks.